All right. Turn to Ezekiel chapter 8. And this will be another chapter that we can get through in one sermon. Probably the next two. And in chapter 10, we'll slow down a little bit on it. And if you've read chapter 10 yet, you know what I'm talking about. It's kind of a repeat of chapter 1. So we'll get to that when we get to it. Chapter 8, the Lord is still showing or talking with Ezekiel about things that are going to happen in Jerusalem. This is all prophecy. I guess it's all prophecy till we get to what we're going to look at tonight. And what we're going to look at tonight, he shows us some things that are going on presently, at the present time, in Ezekiel's day, in Jerusalem, and specifically at the temple. He goes into more detail here than Jeremiah did, even when Jeremiah talked about the temple and what was going on there. In Jeremiah we learned that the priests even were behind the spiritual adultery. They approved it. They allowed it to take place in the temple. And basically that's all we hear from Jeremiah is kind of along those lines. But tonight we're going to see some of the things that they were doing actually. And Ezekiel goes into, like I said, it goes into more detail. And the Lord takes him to the temple in a vision and shows him what's going on. So, chapter 8, verse 1. And it came to pass in the 6th year, in the 6th month, in the 5th day of the month, and we get an exact time frame here. As I sat in mine house, and the elders of Judah sat before me, that the hand of the Lord fell there upon me. So this 6th year is the 6th month and 6th and 5th day of the month is the time that they've been in captivity. That Ezekiel's been in captivity. This would have been, remember, the first group that was taken captive out of the land. And notice he's at his house, he says, mine house. So remember, when they were taken captive, we call it captivity, but they also had some modern conveniences, if you will. Many of them had homes. Now, did they have to build them themselves? I don't know, possibly. I don't know how the area was where they moved to there by the river Chebar where he was at. Was there already housing available to them? Who knows? Those are questions we can't answer and won't. Okay, so I'm not going to guess on it. But he had a home, which tells us that if he had a home, then there were others. And the elders of Judah sat before me. In other words, remember there were some of the priests that were taken captive. And so some of those elders are there with him at his house. And he says the hand of the Lord fell upon him there. In other words, the Lord come to him and he's in a trance, or he's going to see a vision. And he says, then I beheld, and lo, a likeness as the appearance of fire, from the appearance of his loins even downward fire, and from his loins even upward as the appearance of brightness, as the color of amber. And if you've been keeping up with what we studied throughout this whole book so far, obviously this is the Lord he's talking about. We see in other books the likeness of this. What we read in Revelation, there were times that the Lord appeared in like manner. So this is nothing. There's no secret to what he's writing here. It's obvious what he's talking about. And he put forth the form of an hand, and took me by a lock of mine head, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven, and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the inner gate that looketh toward the north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provoketh to jealousy. So several things in this verse. First, the Lord puts forth the form of a hand. So it's what appears to be a hand, and grabs him by the hair and lifts him up. Grabs him by the hair on the back of his neck, is what some commentaries tell us. Is how they refer to this. I don't know. It just says a lock of mine head. So he picks him up by the hair, not in a way it's going to hurt him though. We think of grabbing someone by the hair and jerking them around, and it's painful. But it's not how it is here. He doesn't mention any pain here. He picks him up and holds him between the earth and the heaven. Not the heaven where God is, but the space above the earth, our atmosphere. And he says, brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem. So God is giving him a vision, and in this vision, he's taken to Jerusalem. This whole thing is a vision. It's not. Some say it didn't. It's not something that actually happened physically, but it was a vision that the Lord showed him. Maybe that's the way to describe it. But he says here to Jerusalem. So he's going back to Jerusalem, and remember, it's been over 6 years. 6.5 years since he's been there. And then he says, to the door of the inner gate that looketh toward the north. Now, some will say that this is referring to the inner gate of the city, or the inner door of the city. The city, if you remember, most cities back in that day, in Jerusalem included, you had an outer wall and an inner wall. When the city of Jerusalem was besieged, the invading army, they overthrew the outer wall first, and then if you go back and you look where we talked about when he drew the picture on the tiles, then he was talking about them encamping about up against the wall. Even he was talking about the outer wall. The inner wall would have been the last defense for those in the city. Many times in those days, and even on up into medieval times in Europe, they would do this. You'd have an outer wall, and then in between the two walls is where they'd set traps and all kinds of stuff to slow down the invading army. Sometimes it worked, sometimes it didn't. But in this case, he's not talking about the wall, the door of the city. He's talking about, he says, to the door of the inner gate that looketh toward the north. He's talking about the temple. And as we read this, if you see it in its context, you'll see that that's what he's talking about here. He's referring to the door of the inner gate of the temple. And he says, where was the seat of the image of jealousy? And the image of jealousy which provoketh to jealousy. What is he talking about here? A false god. Why do we say that? Because who's the jealous one here? Wasn't it God? God was jealous because his people forsook him and went after a false god, or false gods, actually. In this case, in this instance here, there was an image seated just inside the door of the inner gate. A false god in God's house. That's how corrupt they had become. They had become so corrupt that they had put idols in God's own house, and then they expected God to bless them. You know, does that sound like Christianity today? We have idols. Churches even have idols, and I say churches loosely. Remember, I'm not. And the same thing with Christianity. I'm talking about the religious world as a whole. Have idols in their what's supposed to be their worship, their place of worship to God, and that's what it's false gods. They observe those more than others. You know, I know there's been times and it's been a while, been a long time since I've seen this, but there were times where churches, and some Baptist churches I know did this. Somebody would pass away, and or somebody's grandma would pass away, and she would leave a picture of what was supposed to be Jesus to the church. And out of respect, the church would hang it somewhere, not usually in the sanctuary, but in the fellowship hall or one of the Sunday school rooms or something like that. I'm sure most of you have seen that. It's an idol. We try not to disrespect others, but sometimes you got to put your foot down and tell them, no, we can't do that. We don't believe that way. That's not scriptural. As simple as that. But it has happened. I saw David Green posted this week about getting their church's name in the local paper and their ad, and the reporter who had put it in there put him in as reverend, and he had to call him back and correct him. That's a common mistake that the world makes. I say mistake, they don't know any better is the problem. Just because you're a pastor, they refer to you as reverend. Even though you can tell them and you can take them to the scripture and show them where it's wrong, and they still won't believe you. They'll still make it. I've known pastors who are dead and gone now, who fought their whole life to get the phone book changed. Because they put reverend in the phone book. Those things the world doesn't understand. Those things are blasphemy to God. They're idols. They're false worship. We don't call any man reverend. That's the name for God only. So here in verse 3, at the end of verse 3, we see that there's an image seated of a statue, probably, more than likely, a statue of jealousy. It's the thing that God has been the most jealous of. John Gill says it in his writing on this. He said that very possibly some of the older writers that he was studying from, and they go further back than even Gill does, were saying that this was probably a statue of Baal, because that is the god, the false god in the Old Testament that is referred to the most, and that is the one false god that God keeps talking about throughout the Old Testament as being the one he hates the most. And even some other writers I've read over the years will say that Baal, at least in the Old Testament, Baal would have been, would have been Satan. That's who those people would have been worshiping, was Satan himself. Again, you go to the internet and you look up the word Baal and to see what he looked like, and you're going to get all kinds of pictures. So be careful. Who knows? I don't. They have found artifacts that they think were probably Baal, statues of Baal, images of Baal in the Middle East. Are those what that was? I don't know. I don't know if anybody could even prove that or not, unless they found his name on it. Maybe they have. I don't know. But Baal, you don't hear mentioned in the New Testament. So I don't know. Verse 4, and behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, according to the vision that I saw in the plain. If you go back to Ezekiel chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. And the hand of the Lord was there upon me, and he said unto me, Arise, and go forth into the plain, and I will there talk with thee. Then I arose and went forth into the plain, and behold, the glory of the Lord stood there, as the glory which I saw by the river of Chebar, and I fell on my face. So, back in chapter 8, verse 4, The glory of the God of Israel was there, according to the vision that I saw in the plain. So he's referring back to chapter 3, verses 22 and 23. Then if you look at back in Ezekiel chapter 1 in verse 28, as the presence of the bow that is in the cloud in the day of rain, talking about the rainbow, so was the appearance of the brightness round about. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face, and I heard a voice of one that spake. So the same thing he saw in chapter 1 and chapter 3 is the same thing that he sees in chapter 4. That's what he refers back to every time. According to the vision that I saw in the plain. Is that the vision of the wheels and the cherubims? Possibly. We'll look at that more when we get to chapter 10. Verse 5. Then said he unto me, Son of man, lift up thine eyes now the way toward the north. So I lifted up mine eyes the way toward the north, and behold, northward at the gate of the altar, this image of jealousy in the entry. Again, this is why I say this is the temple, because he refers to the altar here, and to the image of jealousy is in the entryway. So it's in the entryway into where the altar is, the Holy of Holies. How more blasphemous can you get than to put a statue of Baal in the entryway to the Holy of Holies? He said furthermore unto me, Son of man, seest thou what they do? Even the great abominations that the house of Israel committeth here, that I should go far off from my sanctuary. But turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations. You see what they're doing in my house, is what God's telling him. This is why the Lord is telling Ezekiel, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. This is why you folks are in captivity, because this is what has happened. Did Ezekiel know these things were going on before he left Israel, before he left Judah? I don't know. Possibly. He was of the line of priest. He was a prophet. Well, actually, he wasn't called a prophet until after he went into captivity, but he was of the priest. It's very possible that he saw some of these things before, but maybe not in detail, because the Lord's about to show him some things that were hidden, that he couldn't have seen, or so it seems anyway. And I don't know, maybe these things came about after he left. That's always possible too. That's kind of the way I lean here, because he's telling him the things he's telling him here. He's telling him like he hasn't seen them before. But even the great abominations that the house of Israel committeth here, that I should go far off from my sanctuary. This is God's house that they've committed these abominations in. We think of today, especially the Lord's true churches, and when one of those churches allows things in that are not scriptural, they begin to follow the world more than they follow God. Not specifically the building, but the church itself. That's God's house. The building, of course, has been set aside for worshiping God. So it affects. I guess you could say it is an abomination in His house. And then he says, "But turn thee again, and thou shalt see greater abominations." This is bad enough, but just wait. There's more. There's more to come. There's more. He's about to show him more. It's even worse. And he brought me to the door of the court. And when I looked, behold, a wall, or a hole in the wall. Then said he unto me, Son of man, dig now in the wall. And when I had digged in the wall, behold, a door. He finds a hidden door. So we know he hasn't seen this before. This is something new to Ezekiel. Something done in secret. And he said unto me, Go in, and behold the wicked abominations that they do here. I don't know for whatever reason, but in my mind, when I was studying this especially, and even now, when he talks about this digging in the wall and behold there's a door, reminds me of the secret societies. You know, the Freemasons. There's others like them, and even the not the Jehovah's Witnesses. The Jehovah's Witnesses do the same thing. Mormons do the same thing. Very similar. They do, their elders, so-called elders, do things in secret that the general population, the general public doesn't see, and even their general low-level members never see. If they did see, a lot of people would recognize that it's not biblical. These things are done in secret. Verse 9, and he said unto me, Go in, and behold the wicked abominations that they do here. But just like I was talking about with those organizations, things that are done in secret, wicked things that are done in secret, observances and ceremonies that are done in secret that are very wicked, that are demonic in nature, and yet many of those organizations claim to be Christian. So I went in and saw, and behold, every form of creeping things, an abominable beast, and all the idols of the house of Israel portrayed upon the wall round about. So, again, we're not sure by the way he describes this. Was it paintings, pictures? Was it, in some places they have like little shells on the wall with statues setting on them. Possibly some of both, some of all of that. I don't know. It doesn't really tell us here. But all the idols of the house of Israel. In God's house. Idols. And if you notice, it's idols to creeping things, an abominable beast. What does he mean by abominable beast? It would be those beasts that back in the law that the children of Israel were not to have anything to do with. They weren't to eat of them. They weren't to offer them for sacrifices. Yet, that's the things they're worshiping. Insects. I know we hate to say it, but pigs and certain fish. Well, yeah. But there were certain things in the law that insects and creeping things and certain animals that they weren't to have anything to do with. God had a reason for it, and yet here in his own house they have statues of those things, portraits of those things, or not portraits, but they wouldn't have had portraits back then, but paintings possibly, portrayed on the wall round about. And where does he tell us this is? If you go back, the door, back in verse 7, the door of the court, and when I looked up, behold, a hole in the wall. This hole in the wall, some say, and I when I was reading through Gil, from what I'm understanding from him and from some others, looks like this hole in the wall was going into the Holy of Holies. They had these idols in the inner court, in the inner part of the Holy of Holies. And there, in verse 11, and there stood before them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel. Now, what does he mean by that? The Sanhedrin court had 70 members. And they would have been the elders. Ancients is another word for ancients is elders. They were the elders of the house of Israel. And notice there stood before them, before who? Before the idols. The Sanhedrin was there before the idols. And in the midst of them stood Jezaniah, the son of Shaphan, with every man his censer in his hand, and a thick cloud of incense went up. They're worshiping the false gods in the house of God. And it's not the average Joe on the street. It's the priest, the people who are supposed to know better, the people who are supposed to, that are in charge of keeping the law and making sure that the people keep the law. They're the people in charge, the elders of the congregation. And you know, we see that today in churches where oftentimes when a group within a congregation goes off, oftentimes the pastor follows behind them. The deacons sometimes follow, just so they don't lose numbers, so they don't lose money. You know, that happens pretty regular. Verse 12, then said he unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen what the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark? What does he mean by in the dark? In secret. What are they doing in secret? What are they doing that the people, the congregation, are not seeing? Every man in the chambers of his imagery, for they say, the Lord seeth us not. The Lord hath forsaken the earth. They don't think the Lord sees what they do in private. We know better. They knew better. They were lying to themselves. They knew that the Lord sees everything. Yet, in the chambers of his imagery, in their private quarters, is where they're what they do there. And if they're worshiping false gods, there's no telling what all sins that were being committed. If you remember, the priests lived there in the temple. While they were serving there, they lived there. So these rooms were there in the temple itself, these chambers. And yet they say, the Lord seeth us not. That was what they told the people. If the people were to find out, that was their excuse. Well, the Lord doesn't see these things. And when you have elders in a congregation doing that, what do you think the people are going to do? Well, human nature is they're going to want to follow their leaders, right? Verse 13, he said also unto me, turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations that they do. So there's even more, and even greater ones. Then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. And behold, there sat women weeping for who? For Tammuz. That when he says greater abominations, that's what he's talking about. And Gill says on this that the women were doing this in a place that they weren't supposed to be to begin with. The men and the women had places that they could go in the temple and in the temple grounds. And the women, there was a certain place for the women to go. And they weren't even there. They were, he says, at the gate of the Lord's house, which was toward the north. They were by the Holy of Holies doing this. And weeping for Tammuz, a false god. Remember, Jeremiah referred to her as the Queen of Heaven. Or that's what he said the people called her. Very wicked. Then said he unto me, hast thou seen this, O son of man? Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abomination than these. It just keeps going. It doesn't stop. And we think of God's people today, and it's the same. It just doesn't stop. The sin, once they get wrapped up in the world and wrapped up in sin, it just keeps going. Remember Tammuz, the teaching on Tammuz, we see today in some of our holidays, don't we? People want to deny that, but you can look in any secular dictionary and it'll take you back to Tammuz every time on some of the holidays. Verse 16, and he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they worshipped the sun toward the east. Not only are they worshiping false images, now they're worshiping the creation itself. They're worshiping the sun. If you've ever, and I know some of you come out of Catholicism, but you ever see some of the paintings and the statues they have of what they claim is a halo, but it looks more like the image of the sun, doesn't it? They even they have, in some places they even have altars to the sun. Nowadays they've changed the U to an O in trying to hide it, but originally they were altars to the sun, not to the Son of God, but to the sun in the sky. But there's these 25 men, priests, with their backs towards the temple. They've turned their back on God, and they're worshiping the sun. Verse 17, then he said unto me, hast thou seen this, O son of man? Is it a light thing to the house of Judah that they commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence, and have returned to me, or have returned to provoke me to anger, and lo, they put the branch to their nose. They're not taking things serious. They're not taking the things of the Lord serious. And I keep going back to today. We see comparisons from this in today's world, religious world. The majority of the holidays that we observe, or that we see observed, we don't observe them here, but we see observed, fit right in line with this. Images of false gods. There's Tammuz. I mentioned her, the Queen of Heaven, as she's referred to in many places. The worshiping of the sun. It doesn't have to be the sun. There's moon worshipers. There's those that worship the stars and the planets, astrology. And there's soothsayers and those who do witchcraft and things that, there are certain times of the seasons that you'll see groups of people go out and observe the changing of the seasons. There are those who worship Mother Earth more than they worship God. For a child of God, one of the most laughable things out there is the fear that man has that we're destroying the earth. We're not going to destroy the earth. God is. And he tells us that in his word. But you try to tell them that, and now we're to be good stewards of the earth. We're commanded to do that. He told that to Adam. And so there are things that we need to do to conserve the earth. But we're not going to be the ones to destroy it. And to spend millions and trillions of dollars on global warming or climate change or whatever you want to call it, you're wasting your time, because for one, it's been proven false, and again, God's going to be the one to destroy the earth, not man. Back in verse 17, is it a light thing to the house of Judah that they commit the abominations which they commit here? Some people laugh it off. When you go to talking about observing holidays in one of the Lord's churches, people are going to laugh at you. Well, that's not what we're doing. Then why do you do it? What's the purpose? It's not in the Scripture. God doesn't tell us to observe those things. And then he says, for they have filled the land with violence. Now we know that he told Jeremiah that that God himself was sending the army of Babylon to destroy the land. But it was because of what they did. They were the ones that brought the violence on themselves. And we look around us today, and is that not what we're doing today? We're bringing the violence. What's happening around us, especially in our country, is being brought by God's people. Whether we want to admit it or not, the sins of God's people are going to be the downfall of our very nation. Now, again, I'll tell you again, I don't believe in the replacement theology. We're not, the United States is, and no other country on this earth is a replacement for Israel. That's a false doctrine. But God does chastise his own. And if God's people are following after the world and not following him, he may do something about it before he comes back. We don't know. We know we won't be here during the tribulation. That's a different time period. But there's been different times down through history where God did chastise his own people. And what he's doing, what we're reading about here in Israel now and in Judah, is an example of that. What he can do and what he will do if he so chooses. Verse 18, therefore will I also deal in fury. Mine eye shall not spare, neither will I have pity. And though they cry in mine ears with a loud voice, yet will I not hear them. And he didn't. For a very long time, he didn't hear their cries. Does that mean God didn't know they were crying? No, he's God. He's all sovereign. He knows everything. What he's saying is he didn't do anything about it. He didn't show mercy on them like he had in the past. He gave their enemies permission to go in and the ability to go in and overthrow them and take them captive and commit all kinds of atrocities against them because of what they had done to God. So we'll stop there for tonight, and we'll pick up with chapter 9 next time.